A case animal is often called an evidentiary animal, and it's typically an animal that was subject to some sort of crime.
They are both victim and evidence in a case. So you have to potentially store them and house them in a totally different manner than you would normal evidence.
Living creatures that require making sure that they survive, but also making sure that they hopefully have a good outcome while being at the shelter, which is a very highly stressful environment.
And at times, their owners have not relinquished ownership, and until the person is found guilty or not guilty, they might not be willing to relinquish that ownership. So the animal could end up sitting around in a shelter for months or even years until that case is resolved.
Those animals don't deserve to have to sit at a shelter for an extended period of time because we take a long time to move cases through the court system.
In some of our counties, court cases are not heard for almost 18 months in some cases. So the whole purpose of the laws that we've created is to protect animals. It is not protecting animals if we seize the animals, put them in a cage, leave them there for months and months, and then euthanize them. That is not what we're trying to do.
My name is Juan de Leon. I currently serve as the road supervisor for Athens County, and that job entails managing the 5 officers that respond to calls in Athens County. So a case animal is an animal that came into our custody because, for lack of a better word, it just wasn't being treated properly. Either lack of veterinary care, unfortunately sometimes as basic as just food and water, or in the more egregious cases, actually abused physically, either by another animal or a person, unfortunately.
My name's Lisa Milot, and I'm the Annie and Zach Stanton Distinguished Professor of Canine Welfare Law at the University of Georgia. I teach doctrinal classes as well as a law school clinic called the Practicum in Animal Welfare Skills, where my students and I work with jurisdictions around Georgia on animal welfare issues to improve the lives of companion animals and the people who love them. Case animals are animals that are being held pending some legal case. We can't just say, we are done collecting evidence from this animal, so let's find it a new home. Because one of the hardships with case animals is that they can't be handled the way other animals get handled for the most part, because they still belong to someone, and they are still evidence in a case.
My name is Sherry Hines. I'm a Deputy Chief Attorney for the Unified Government of Athens County. I do a lot of different things for the government, but related to today's interview, I represent our Animal Services Department, and I prosecute ordinance violations related to animals. We call them case animals because we're responsible for them while they're in our care, but they're unique to other animals that, may be surrendered to us or come in as strays because there are legal requirements about what we can or cannot do with those animals because they're not actually our property at that point.
I'm Claudine Wilkins. I'm the founder of the Animal Protection Society. I'm a former prosecutor and generally an animal law expert. A case animal is often called an evidentiary animal, and it's typically an animal that was subject to some sort of crime, which can include animal cruelty, abuse, neglect, animal fighting, but it can also include things like a dangerous dog or an animal that was used in the commission of a crime and things of those nature.
Using a search warrant under Title OCGA 1612-4 to seize that animal, the county is required to hold that animal as evidence in a criminal case. My name is Jessica Rock. I am the Georgia State Animal Crimes Resource Prosecutor at the Prosecuting Attorneys Council, and I am also a federal prosecutor who handles animal crimes in the Southern District of Georgia.
And you have an animal involved so that you have literal live evidence that you have to kind of care for and be very cognizant of as you're going through the investigative process here. My name is Alan Barber. I am the Assistant Director for the Practicum in Animal Welfare Skills at the University of Georgia School of Law. I'm also a Reserve Officer with the Athens County Police Department.
And once those animals are seized into the state's custody, then the animals are usually taken somewhere else, whether to a vet clinic or to a shelter or some sort of holding facility.
Case animals are extremely difficult for shelters to handle just because most shelters are an extremely stressful environment. Most of these animals come in, they don't know why they're here, they don't understand. A lot of them have just lived their life on a chain, and so they don't understand what it means to get out and stretch their legs or be around other animals.
A lot of our shelters are way overcrowded at this point in time, more than we've ever seen. We don't want to be taking animals out of a situation and potentially putting them in a worse situation by having them just sit at our animal shelter for an extended period of time.
It's sort of an untenable outcome for the animal because it means that they are essentially warehoused in our shelter for months, honestly years on end, while we wait for a case to resolve itself.
That takes up a space in the municipal shelter. That puts the animal at higher risk for potential diseases. It takes a toll on the animal's mental health. Their entire demeanor can change the longer they stay in that enclosed facility, just because they don't get the same interaction that a normal stray animal or an animal that's been surrendered over gets, just because they are potentially their evidence.
And that is not a good way for really any domestic animal to live. They have limited interactions with human beings. They're stuck in a kennel, for kennels that are designed to be temporary, not long-term solutions. So it's just not an outcome anybody wants.
It's a challenge because evidentiary animals are very much the same as any piece of evidence in a criminal case. However, we, as the state, have to take care of those animals. They have a heartbeat, they need to eat, they need to have shelter. So as a result of that, laws have changed in order to allow us to dispose of those animals prior to a criminal case being heard. But they are very much the same as a piece of evidence as any other case.
And we're also trying to push mental enrichment just so they don't go what we call kennel crazy.
These animals need enrichment and they need care beyond what animals that will only be at the shelter for a week or two need.
Now, what we don't want is an animal that was already abused or neglected, transported into a cage, and then not being able to be adopted because it's been in that cage for over a year. Then that animal has to be euthanized.
And with other sorts of evidence, like a gun, a note, whatever might be taken from the scene of a crime, you can put those things in a box and put them on a shelf and come back to them 2 years later, and they're still fine. But with case animals, you've got a living, breathing creature that has specific social and physical needs that have to be cared for until they can be adopted out or returned to their owner or rescued or, in some cases, euthanized. While we try to do play groups, for example, with animals at the shelter, a lot of the time, the case animals can't be part of those. Play groups are very important for keeping animals sane while they're there. It gives them the interactions, the socialization with other animals, and you can't do that with the case animals because, once again, they have an owner. And so if anything goes wrong, that's somebody else's property you're messing with.
And so we have to take extra precautions to make sure that nothing happens to them, making sure that they're not in view of the general public, making sure the general public can't actually put hands on them or anything like that, and making sure the animals can't interact with them.
They have to have some sort of time frame for moving out, because if you leave them there for months or even in some cases years, you have an animal that is really having more suffering inflicted on it than occurred in the original situation. We have agreed that in the shelter setting, when we have an animal come in that we think is part of a cruelty case that we know is going to take a while to dispose of, we immediately start talking about an enrichment program for that animal now. Even if it's a small animal, we want it in one of the full-size kennels so that it has the room to move around and it's not more confined. And then the volunteers who are more experienced, so it's me and a handful of others who volunteer a lot at the shelter, start doing more enrichment things with these animals.
Only a select few are allowed to actually care for them. And at the same time, we're in constant communication with the dog owner or the cat owner, letting them know exactly what's going on and letting them know that the case is moving forward and always, again, offering an owner surrender down the road.
One of the things we've done here in Athens, Clarke County, because we were having some instances where animals were lingering a bit long at the shelter. So they came in on a cruelty case, all the evidence that we needed from them had been collected, but we still couldn't dispose of them because the owner had not surrendered and we didn't have a court order. So we've decided that we have a general time frame for filing charges and then for taking all of the actions we need to take to be able to dispose of the animal. So we've agreed that in general, we want charges to be filed within 1.5 to 2 weeks at most. And the reason for that deadline is that there are some ways of getting the animals disposed of that you need to have a legal case for. So you need to file the charges, so we can't move ahead with those means of having the animals released until we file the case. We want to have the animals at a point where we can ask the prosecutor if they are okay with us rehoming the animal after about 1.5 to 2 months at most.
There are a lot of times when you're investigating a complaint from a citizen where an animal needs to be seized. But that doesn't always mean that the animal couldn't ever go back to the home. There may be people who, out of poverty or ignorance, inertia, they just didn't really understand or didn't take the effort to learn about what, for instance, their pet needs. On an ordinance level, we might want to educate the owner and send the animal back. Now, when we're talking about animal cruelty cases, that's a very different thing because, as I said, we have this statutory provision that says we can't return the animal. And quite frankly, we typically don't want to. If someone has gotten to the level that they have neglected their animal so badly that commonly it's near death, or in fact the animal has died, or for instance, say one animal in the home has died, but the other 2 or 3 may have not quite risen to that level, we obviously have significant concerns for the welfare of the animals involved to send them back. So in those cases, our ideal outcome is an immediate surrender of the animal. If a person says, I realize that I couldn't take care of all these animals that I had, I would like to surrender them so that they can get the care they need. That's an ideal circumstance.
So if we're talking about a cruelty case, we're talking about a case where we have a known owner for an animal. There's somebody that we're saying owned this animal, had a duty to it, and committed cruelty, or at least that's usually the scenario. You can actually commit cruelty to an animal you don't own. But in most instances where we're at the shelter, we're dealing with cases where somebody is violating the state cruelty statute with respect to an animal they own. And when that happens, because animals are legally property, we can't just say, okay, well, we are done collecting evidence from this animal, so let's find it a new home. Because until the person is found guilty or gives up their rights in some way, or until a court orders the rights are stripped from them, that person still has the property rights to the animal.
Separately, of course, from that is just the sort of humane interest in a living being that we want to have a good outcome for. It's challenging to try to meet all of those needs. And so one of the things that we try to do is get legal ownership of a case animal as soon as possible, whether that's from an owner surrendering the animal or whether it's through a court process. If we can't get a surrender for whatever reason, because obviously people have a right to their property, then we're talking about either a cost of care petition or a disposal petition under Title IV to try to ask the courts to give those animals to us, to make them Athens-Hart County's property.
Having an animal surrendered is very, very important. It allows us to move the animal through the shelter faster. And so we really want to get them out of here as soon as possible while making sure that they are not only being adopted or rescued, but they can go to a good home.
If the owner is on scene and I, as law enforcement, I'm there, I'm going to be talking to the owner and definitely going to be bringing up the option of having them surrender the animal over to Animal Services.
And what the officers should look for are the following. 1, to make sure the person giving consent is actually the owner. And the owner doesn't have to be somebody written on paper. It can be someone in custody and control. And there could be multiple owners. So you can also charge multiple people. That person should be over the age of 18. The consent should be done in writing, and there should not be any trickery or coercion in this consent.
If you are going to seize an animal from an owner, you always want to ask for an owner surrender. And this is actually really an important point because that does a couple things. For one, we don't want to be negotiating away criminal charges. In other words, I tell law enforcement when we do trainings on this issue, we don't tell somebody who we're arresting for possession of cocaine, if you give me the cocaine, we're not going to charge you. We don't want to make a habit of doing that in animal crimes either, because word will get around that if you're suspected of animal cruelty and you just give up your animal, they won't charge you. And so we don't want that to be the norm in the situation.
We don't think about dogs and cats as having legal title, but in fact, all of those rights that are property rights with respect to an animal, they add up to legal title. So we might not have a paper like we do with a car or a house, but we still have that concept of title, and you can't transfer that title to someone else as long as the original owner is still holding on to it.
So a lot of times the owner doesn't want to own a surrender in the field for a multitude of different reasons. It could be they don't want to acknowledge guilt, or in their own way, they do want the animal back.
So back in 2016, we passed a law that allows a seizing agency to file a pretrial civil petition with the court that allows us to ask for the owner to have to pay the cost of caring for that animal while the case is pending.
The owner at that point has to pay us back for the vet visits, all the food, everything that we've given the animal, because it can all be broken down to a monetary value. And if they don't, at that point, they would forfeit the animal to us.
The cost of care statute can be found in Georgia Code Section 4-11-9.8. The attorney that represents the jurisdiction that impounded the animal, usually a county or city attorney, prepares a brief petition explaining the circumstances, time, place, location, and reason of the impoundment, and its legal authority, and the name and address of the animal owner. The cost of caring for the impounded animals are included from the date of seizure, as well as the monthly anticipated costs going forward. After the defendant is served, the court sets a hearing for 10 to 15 days after return of service of process. The hearing is limited to determining whether the impoundment was authorized. Was there a search warrant or exigent circumstances? If so, the owner must pay the reasonable accrued expenses in each following 30 days care in advance, or title is forfeited and the animal becomes owned by the impounding agency. Oftentimes, there does not even need to be a hearing on the petition. Many defendants, once presented with the petition, choose to surrender title to their animals instead of being required to pay indefinitely for their care.
There's one exemption to the cost of care, and that is a person who can prove that they are indigent. The court may either reduce the cost of care or may waive the cost of care altogether. However, it only applies if only one animal is impounded. So if 2 or more animals are impounded, the indigency clause does not work with the cost of care.
Separately from that, we have the disposal order. The disposal order does not have a lot of structure. So if you go back to the cost of care petition, there's a very detailed set of requirements for how that petition is filed, when the hearing has to be held, and importantly, how the judge makes that decision. In fact, it very specifically says that the only item of concern for the judge is whether the animal was seized appropriately or not. So it's not very defendant friendly is what I would say. The disposal order really leaves almost everything up to the judge. There's no requirement on when it needs to be filed, when the hearing would be held. All it says is that a entity that has custody of an animal, a case animal, as we would say, can file with the court a request to be able to dispose the animal. And as long as we have the permission of the prosecuting attorney, in other words, they don't think we still need it for evidence purposes, the judge can order the disposal of the animal. Personally, I suspect it was written in such a broad way to account for very large case animal situations. You know, if you have 200 dogs that were seized from a boarding facility, I would imagine that there isn't an animal shelter in the nation that has the ability to hold 200 dogs for a year or two while a case proceeds. So I think that's probably why there's a lot of flexibility built in. And so I think, you know, for attorneys representing animal services departments watching this film, the best thing to do is to file the disposal order as soon as possible. If you genuinely can't continue to hold an animal and a cost of care petition isn't the avenue of choice for you all, because you don't have to hold the animals for 60 days. You can file it really the next day, as long as your prosecutor allows you and is amenable to the animals being released.
A lot of the cases we get, the owner is either not there or there's an eviction involved. The owner finds out there's potentially criminal charges involved, and they ghost. They disappear. And trying to track them down is not always an easy thing. We're kind of stuck in limbo. We either have to get a court order or have to go through several other different processes to try and get the ownership over to the county itself.
And we had to do this because we had a couple of cases where animals came in. For example, there were 3 dogs that were being held at the shelter, and after 8 months, we still weren't quite certain where their owner was. She had moved out of an apartment, leaving the dogs behind, and we were having difficulty tracking her down. But this was 8 months later, and the dogs were in the shelter going stir crazy. Then you have to ask, well, how does that person get notice that you're going to take the property rights away? That's one of the big challenges with respect to case animals, is just having prosecutors know how to navigate these various different provisions, because this isn't something they do every day.
So we just need to be mindful when we have those cases and we have animals sitting at our shelter because for whatever reason we didn't have an owner surrender or a cost of care petition was not filed. We just need to try to move those cases into disposition as soon as possible.
A Title IV disposition action authorized by OCGA Section 4-11-9.3 can be filed in conjunction with a cost of care petition, as it is a separate petition that asks the court having jurisdiction over the offense to transfer legal ownership of the animal to the agency prior to trial. The only statutory requirement is that the prosecuting attorney has to agree. These petitions are especially helpful when the animal's owner cannot be located, refuses to participate, or when the number of animals seized is large enough to make housing them pending trial infeasible. In these situations, agencies can document the challenges they've faced and their attempts to address them. For example, the reasonable efforts made to contact the owner to justify why early disposition is appropriate. Even after title is resolved, animals may still need to be held because they're considered evidence in the criminal case. To release them, the agency must request consent from the prosecuting attorney, who has to confirm that all necessary evidence has been gathered and the animal can be released. Once that confirmation is documented, the animal can legally be released to rescue, adoption, or other permanent placement.
One of the challenges with case animals is that under the state statutes, there are processes for getting the animals released if at least for the state cruelty and state dogfighting cases. There's processes for getting the animals released if their owner has not surrendered them, but it takes someone experienced with the various different titles in the Georgia Code. So for example, if an animal was impounded for cruelty or dogfighting or some other specified offenses, and that was part of the original impound, and you can find the owner, then a cost of care petition can be a really good way to get that animal released. If instead it was a Title IV impound, you might need a Title IV disposition action, but a lot of times people aren't sure when you use.
So it's confusing. However, it's important to know that the pitfalls here is that the training is very lacking. The agencies having custody of or having the seizure of the animals, they have to rely on their county attorneys or city attorneys to file these petitions. And they also always have to get consent from the prosecuting attorney, because what we don't want to do is get the animals out before the evidence is collected from that animal.
Training is obviously a critical component of this, and that's one of the reasons why we are developing, these videos for law enforcement to understand. I think once they know the procedure and once enforcement agencies understand how to go about handling live animal evidence, it just makes things a lot easier. And that's why it's important to work with other agencies within your community who may be a part of that.
The triplet case was a very interesting and unfortunate one. I wasn't the initial responding officer, but the ACO was called out because something smelled dead in the house. It was actually a welfare check with the police department. And so when they got out there, the police department was able to make entry. They found 3 dogs. One dog with just egregious wounds around her neck, and they were all very, very emaciated, but there was also a dead dog inside the house.
They had really bad injuries at first, and they had been starved, and so they were pretty skeletal. And so it took about a month and a half or 2 months until they were actually in a condition that we could even have thought of adopting them out.
Essentially, the dogs had been left alone for such a prolonged period of time. They actually started to attack each other.
Juan and Alan both did a great job of finally tracking down the owner and talking with her and getting the dogs released. And the first day they were released, at first we just took them out to interaction pens. And that was great because it was just so wonderful to see them just getting love and running and having fun. And on the fence line with the other dogs, they seemed fine. They weren't showing the same reactivity they were in the kennels, but we weren't quite sure what to do, and the shelter was full, and so we were talking about perhaps having to euthanize for space, and those 3 dogs are the obvious ones to euthanize for space. They've been at the shelter the longest. We don't know if they're dog friendly. Well, shelter staff decided they wanted to make sure they were dog tested, that before we assumed they were not good with dogs or chose them to be euthanized, that they had a chance to prove themselves. And so we were kind of cautious about it. Tried them first with each other, and they were fine with each other, and then we tried them with other dogs, and it turned out they were all wonderful. All 3 of them got adopted really quickly. Part of it was we had this story for them, but part of it was they were just such wonderful dogs. And it's one of those things that when you're at a shelter and you're walking around and you see the dogs that are reactive, nobody in their right mind wants to take one of those dogs home. But the dog might be entirely different when she or he is out of the kennel, and that was the case with the triplets, and it was just so wonderful to see them go from the first day they were at the vet's office when they brought in from the property. And we weren't sure if they were going to make it. They could barely stand, and they had such bad wounds, to see them go to these wonderful homes. And we still get updates from some of the adopters, and it's just really heartwarming to see how that turned out.
A better collaboration between the agencies, it would be amazing because, it streamlines the process of the animal gets picked up, the animal gets cared for, but the charges are being pressed, the animal becomes ours, and then we can put it up for adoption. That would help the community in itself, that our resources can now be used for the next dog, for the next cat, for the next animal that was abused. And it would just streamline the process of making sure that those that did those infractions or committed animal cruelty are properly charged and those charges aren't dropped.